So, what validates paternity within the African Igbo context? We live in an age of DNA. We live in an age where everybody wants to check if they are the biological father of their children. And it has raised a lot of question on the cultural standpoint on what paternity is or paternity fraud. If it existed back in the day, how did our ancestors handle such occurrence? So my question today is, what validates paternity within the African Igbo context? Now, before I move further in this discussion, I would really appreciate it if you want to engage with me in the comment section, you keep it respectful, because this topic is a hard nut to crack. Personally, to me, it is a hard one, and many African men are not receptive of the cultural standpoint of what the Igbo people, how we handle this issue, and what actually validates paternity within our African context. So it is essential that we look at this study or this conversation from an academic point of view, from an academic perception, and we can, engage very well without hurting each other's feelings and emotions. Now, what validates paternity in African Igbo context? So it is important to note that within our social structure, what validates paternity, what determines that a child is yours, is not based on biology, but based on the paying of the bride price, ego-isi nwaanyi. This is the only thing that validates paternity within our Igbo African context. Now, if you are a father or you impregnate a woman without getting married to her, the Igbo cultural standpoint says that that child is not yours. That child is not yours. That child belongs to the man that performs the traditional rites of ego-isi nwaanyi before he or she would have claim to that, before you, the man, would have claim to that child. And if you don't pay the bride price or the bride wealth of that woman, that child, even though the child is biologically yours, but within the Igbo context, you are not going to be recognized as the father to that child. So what validates paternity in our context is the bride price or the bride wealth. It is the only established structure that determines the paternity of a child, and not necessarily biological or blood affiliations. Now, why does bride price shelter, or was it the only established structure that determines paternity? Now, we need to understand that this particular practice shelters the needs of men who are unable to impregnate their wives. Therefore, the men are going to encourage those women to step outside of the marriage, sleep with another person in order to procreate and save face. Now, occasionally some women, even without telling their husbands, they'll sneak behind the husband and they'll go and do, when they find out that the man is impotent, then they do it conspicuously behind the man's, the man is unaware of what is happening. But in some established cases, the man, when he recognizes that he has this problem, would encourage the wife to step out in order to fulfill this particular need. Therefore, it is essential that we understand that, first of all, this practice is specifically tied, or it was specifically done to shelter men that fall within this category. Now, another group of men are other men who feel that they could want the genetic makeup of another man to be within his lineage or within his family. So what happens here is that maybe the man is courageous. They know him for his bravery. They know him to being a very honest, wealthy individual. So the man could engage with him. I want your genetic makeup within my lineage, and that could happen. He could send one of his wife to go and sleep with the man and be able to get that genetic makeup, which comes in the form of a child within his lineage. Now, again, because bride price is what validates paternity within the African Igbo context, there is no question asked about who is the father of that child. So what happens here is that the man that pays the bride price of that woman automatically he claims ownership of that child. So again, it's because our African way of life, our bride price has structured it to mean that what determines paternity is this cultural practice of ego-isi nwaanyi and not necessarily our biological ties. Now, to explain further why this practice exists, let's look at this instance. Now, regrettably, because when I was trying to analyze it, it was very awkward, comparing a woman to something like a piece of land or an investment. But for the sake of this conversation, let me use these instances to give an explanation. Now, for instance, you use your money, you go into the field and you make a purchase of land or an investment. Now, whatever the land yields or whatever the profits of your investment gets, it belongs to you. Now, in this context, we can look at as the woman as the piece of property or investment that a man purchases or invests his time and his money in. Now, whatever yield that comes out of that land or that investment automatically belongs to the man because of that single cultural fact of he has paid. So bride price in this context is basically synonymous with a man using his money to go and make such purchase. So this is why what validates paternity is the bride price. Now, what happens in the case of infidelity, because this is where it is a hard nut to crack. Now, in case of infidelity, like I said earlier, biology does not determine paternity in our context. Biology, you're just there as the biological father, as the person that contributed the genetic makeup of the child. But what the society sees and says, you are the father of this child, is did you pay her bride price? So in cases of infidelity, because you've paid that bride price, that child that was born out of infidelity belongs to you as the man. So it is not a system of you've conducted a DNA test and you find out that this child does not belong to you and you decide to, send the child back to the mother's side or, chase the woman and the child away. It is not done within our context. Now you can do whatever you want with the woman, which what happens here is that the woman is going to come before you with some items like goats, yams and everything, and you use those items to appease your ancestors on the chi. She would use those items to beg for their forgiveness. And once that is done, if you decide to keep her in your house, it's your choice. But that child is yours to protect and to cater for. You are honor bound not to send that child out of your home. You can do anything you want with the mother, but that child is culturally, spiritually has been recognized as yours. Because again, in our context, what validates that this child belongs to you, paternity, is the cultural practice of ego-isi nwaanyi. So even if it's a case of infidelity, that child still belongs to you as Onye. Now, the biggest question in this 21st century is, should this cultural practice be encouraged in this 21st century? Okay, first of all, I'm a big fan of understanding the foundations that our ancestors laid and things they did, the way they did it. You understand this. Then we need to be able to figure out progressive ways that we will be able to, use those ideas and push them into our own reality to be able to make us have a good, make us to live a good life, and forcing people to take care of a child that is not biologically theirs it's tantamount to destroying their life, and if they have any sort of an ambition. So personally, what I wrote down here is, in terms of paternity being traced through the socio-cultural context? Should it become continued in this century where issues that led to these institutions are no longer viable? Or can it be handled or managed through alternative means? Now, just like I mentioned earlier, cases of a man being impotent and cases of high child mortality within our Asian society, all these things contributed to the institution of this particular cultural practice. And whilst this was the case, we have other modern means of interventions, other means like IVF, sperm boost therapy, surrogacy, and other medical equipment that can be used to detect early danger signs of prenatal maternal health. So if the case of this infidelity, of this paternity fraud, is because the man was impotent and the woman decides to step out, there are other medical and modern ways that we can use to curb it. Even the man even telling the woman, go outside there and get pregnant by another man and bring back the child inside the home. We have modern alternative, which includes IVF, sperm boost therapy, surrogacy, when they get their genetic materials, and basically medically they are about to establish a cell that is going to form into a fetus and implant it to grow into a child in the womb. So we have medical alternatives that we can explore before going into maybe the traditional way of handling these kinds of issue. Now, one thing that makes me say no to this particular practice is, especially in this modern century, is that we need to recognize that the economic means to raise and train these children, it is not the same thing as it was back in the day. Then it is the raising of a child, or the instrument or the resources to raise a child, is not limited to one singular individual to fight for, to hustle for, and to cater for. Now, this particular way of doing things, it has basically exceeded its reality. Currently, for a man to be able to save up, marry a wife, have a home, raise those children, the economic resources needed are much more on the high rate compared to what our ancestors needed for this very needed to be able to raise their children. All they needed to was have a couple of yams in the barn, raise their children. Even the children can even go to their extended families to eat, and everybody contributes in raising those children. But within our own reality, those realities of the past is no longer of today. Now, for a man to be able to raise or get the resources to raise and train his children, he is going to be out there striving in order to fulfill this particular social role or social function. Now, I wrote down here that this social shift has made the social foundation on which the practice of tracing a child's paternity through paying of the bride price to lose its footing in our own century. Therefore, every other culture that was built with this foundation has inadvertently lost its foothold, which makes paternity fraud an immoral act. This is because if you understand what it takes to train and raise a child, you as the woman would understand that giving a child that is not biologically related to a man to raise, it becomes an immoral act. So we need to also consider that men also need to have a more fulfilled life. Now, the only benefit or the only motivation that pushes a man to work hard is because he is doing it for his children. So no matter how the economic situation is in the country, you see that the men are always there hustling, trying to fulfill this particular role because of that biological tether that they have to their child. So imagine how many years down the line, after all the suffering and everything, the man figures out that this child is not biologically his, whereas his only motivation is the joy that he's doing it to his family. But aside telling you, while I don't think it should be continued in this modern century, within our social context, what says that a child belongs to you is the fact that you paid the bride price. So it now depends on you how you, if you wish to, because culture has says this child belongs to you, if you want to, if you decide to use this culture to your own advantage. But we don't have to use it as an excuse to say that fidelity is okay in marriage. It is not. So this culture has never even supported infidelity, because what it tells you here is that if you commit any form of infidelity, you're going to perform what we call the Igbo cleansing, right? To make sure that you don't bring in those kind of abomination, that you don't repeat such an offense in the future. So infidelity is not what this practice is talking about. It is only trying, it shelters to the needs of a certain category of men who don't have the right genetic makeup to impregnate and to procreate. So it specifically shelters, and it also protects a child from not having a father or an identity or a name, especially now that we see that a lot of men are impregnating women without claiming their child. So you see that this practice also protects that child. Now, when a man marries in that woman and decides to give that child his name, he's within his cultural right to do it. But traditionally, that child already belongs to the family of the mother, until maybe a man marries her and decides to give that name to that child. Now, in summary, we need to understand that every cultural practice we assimilated now or in the past is there to perform a singular function or multiple function, which it is the promotion of our standard of living whilst enabling us to live a more fulfilled life. Therefore, whenever a culture fails to achieve that singular fact, then those interacting with the culture are at liberty to allow the culture to die a natural death or evolve into something that would boost our natural affinity to survive. Now, finally, this also brings me to the subject of polygamy. Now, this particular practice, it makes women uneasy with a tendency of, lashing out, even though it has a cultural foundation. But because the way things are is not with the way things were then before, polygamy makes women uneasy. The same way when we also tell men that culture says that even if your wife was cheating and because of infidelity has a child for you, you are culture bound to take care of that child and provide for that child and treat that. In fact, you are supposed to step in as the social father of that child. You're going to play the role of a social father and not the role of a biological father. So I think this is where our culture was coming from. They understood that we can have two different kinds of fathers. We can have a social father or a biological father. A biological father is already a father that has a biological ties to a child, while a social father is a father that has ties to a child through these socio-cultural means of determining paternity and adoption. So this is what our culture is talking about. Now, when we now look at polygamy and this culture and this particular culture and how everybody is, ranting and lashing out, and everybody is kind of against it because we're saying, oh, it doesn't really make sense. It's not going to apply to our reality. This is where I'm now trying to tell you that culture exists to maintain an equilibrium. It is there to maintain balance. It is there to create, to shelter, to provide a function. Now, those of us that are interacting with those culture, we are the determining factor, determining if we should continue the practice, the reverence of that culture, or if we would abandon it or allow it to die or evolve. Now, this is the Igbo perception about paternity fraud and what determines paternity within the Igbo African context. And until next time, yeah, guys, yeah.